Hello, welcome to this week's lecture. This is Dr. Rebecca Wood, your instructor, and this week we are going to talk about St. Louis and the Civil War because St. Louis was literally in the center of a divided country. During this week, we learn about how much families and lives were torn apart by the Civil War and also by the run-up to the Civil War. In fact, one of our authors was born a slave because his mother was a slave. And when you read his material, you will see that he felt very out of place in many places and was not entirely welcome in St. Louis, although he made a fortune here. And James Thomas's mother operated a laundry business and was financially successful enough to buy his freedom. But as our book says, he didn't get his freedom until he was older because of the laws there. And when James Thomas was born, his father was a very prominent man, becoming Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court and then a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. And the reason I mention that is that when John Catron was a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, he was one of those justices who decided against Dred Scott in the Dred Scott decision, which was a case that originated in St. Louis. And Dred Scott was a slave who had sued for his freedom, and the United States Supreme Court denied his request. And then, in addition, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Abraham Lincoln never lived in St. Louis that we know of. We don't have a lot of signs that say Lincoln slept here in St. Louis, but he did practice law and was elected to the state legislature in Illinois, which is very close by. And during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he was a strong voice against slavery, which turned most people in the South against him. And then on November 6, 1860, President Lincoln won the election without the support of a single Southern state, which further divided the country. And then warfare actually broke out, and that was at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And as an aside, I grew up partially in South Carolina. We lived there for several years, and I have been to Fort Sumter, and it is kept as a shrine to the beginning of the war. And I will tell you that there is a different attitude toward the Civil War in South Carolina than you might find in some other states to this day. And here is an example of some members of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War here in St. Louis, honoring General William Tecumseh Sherman. He was one of the very successful generals of the Union War. He's buried here at Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. And so many Americans still honor the fallen heroes of the American Civil War, including reenactments of entire battles. And William Sherman is one of our authors this week, and you can read about how his life was affected while he lived in St. Louis and prepared for his participation in the Civil War. And not everyone honors the same heroes, and you might find that the heroes are different in St. Louis or parts of St. Louis than other parts of St. Louis or the country. And so the history of the Civil War continues to affect our country and our city even today. And then we also have a different perspective on St. Louis and the Civil War. One of our other authors is Anthony Trollope, who supported the Union faction. It made him unpopular in the southern states, and he did not visit them while he was here. He was visiting England rather like Charles Dickens did. And Trollope wrote vividly about the heartbreaking run-up to the destruction of war. And here's a quote from his work in our textbook. Men and angels must weep as they behold the things that are being done, as they watch the ruin that has come upon them, and they are showing themselves to be as eager in the works of war as they have shown themselves capable in the works of peace. And I find that to be very poignant and sad. And then we also have the voice of Antoine Auguste Laguerre, and I will not attempt to pronounce the title of his book in French. I took just enough French to know that I will do a very bad job of pronouncing that. And so I Google translated the title of his book. It means the United States during the Civil War. And Laguerre wrote that, quote, with its natural advantages, master of the greatest river in North America, St. Louis could have made faster progress were it not for the enervating influences of slavery. And so he felt and wrote about how slavery actually held St. Louis and other places back rather than helping them progress toward the future. And then General Ulysses S. Grant was very important in the Civil War. Many people credit him with being the general who won the war for Abraham Lincoln and the Union. And he has St. Louis connections. He's not one of our authors this week, but he did some writing and he lived here in St. Louis, and we can visit Whitehaven, the home that he lived with his wife Julia Dent and her family at. And they owned slaves, which gives us kind of a complexity to Grant's character, thinking about how he was a beneficiary of slavery himself, but he fought for the Union and against slavery in the Civil War. And so he also had many successes and failures. He was not always thought of as the best president when he became president, and there's many stories that he had a drinking problem and was not always the most successful person, but he was also a president and a very successful general. So he's a very complex person, or was. And one thing that he did as well that you might find interesting in a literary way, although we certainly don't have time to explore it now, he wrote his autobiography. One reason for that is that his family needed money and he was dying of cancer, and his friend Mark Twain edited that book, and it's said to be one of the best, if not the best, presidential memoirs ever written. So you might be interested in that. And here's an image I found of General Grant, a photograph near the end of his life. So this week we had a somber topic again. The effects of the U.S. Civil War cannot be easily measured, and how could our country, our city move ahead? And of course, we'll be looking forward and ahead in the next lecture and week of our class. Thank you very much, and I hope you all take care and have a good week. Thank you.